Imagine a universe where Earth is known as the galaxy's most dangerous planet, where humans are whispered about in fearful tones as Deathworlders, creatures who somehow survived on a planet that should have killed them 1,000,000 times over. Now imagine what happens when one of these impossible beings walks into the galaxy's most prestigious educational institution, where alien students have never encountered anything more dangerous than a particularly aggressive houseplant. What follows isn't just culture shock, it's a complete rewriting of what the galaxy thought it knew about survival, friendship, and what it truly means to be alive. This is the story of Marcus Chen, the first human to attend the Galactic Collegiate Institute, and how his mere presence turned the most orderly institution in known space into something resembling organized chaos. But here's the twist. The real danger wasn't that Marcus might hurt someone. The real danger was that he might teach them to live. The transport shuttle Gentle Whisper approached the Galactic Collegiate Institute with all the grace of a soap bubble drifting through a cathedral. Its passengers, representing 17 different species from across the galaxy, sat in their specially designed comfort pods, breathing their preferred atmospheric mixtures and maintaining the precise environmental conditions their biology required. In the back corner, squeezed into a pod that was clearly not designed for his species, sat Marcus Chen, the first human ever admitted to the galaxy's most prestigious educational institution. He was trying very hard not to sneeze. The atmospheric mixture in his pod was close to Earth normal, but not quite right. Too much nitrogen, not enough oxygen, and there was a faint metallic taste that suggested the recyclers weren't quite calibrated for human biochemistry. But Marcus had grown up breathing the air of a dozen different mining stations as his parents moved from job to job, so he simply held his breath when the urge to sneeze became too strong and tried to look like he belonged. He definitely did not look like he belonged. While his fellow passengers resembled an art gallery's fever dream, crystalline beings who tinkled like wind chimes when they moved, gaseous entities contained within elegant mechanical bodies, and creatures that looked like they'd been designed by committee and approved by a poet, Marcus looked disturbingly mundane. Brown hair, brown eyes, skin the color of coffee with too much cream, wearing clothes that were clearly mass-produced rather than grown, crafted, or manifested through pure will. The shuttle's pilot, a graceful Etherian named Whisper of Morning Rain, announced their approach through the ship's harmonic communication system. The message arrived not as words, but as a gentle feeling of anticipation mixed with the scent of distant flowers. Marcus received it as a vague sense that something was happening and a sudden craving for jasmine tea. As the institute came into view, even Marcus's human sensibilities were struck dumb. The station was impossibly vast, a flowering mandala of interconnected spheres and spiraling arms that seemed to grow from some central seed rather than being built. Each section was dedicated to different atmospheric and gravitational requirements, connected by transport tubes that bent and curved like the stems of some cosmic plant. Beautiful, isn't it? The voice came from the pod next to his. Marcus turned to see what appeared to be a collection of geometric shapes arranged into a vaguely humanoid form. The being's surfaces shifted through colors that didn't quite exist in human vision, and when it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that made Marcus's teeth ache. "It's incredible," Marcus agreed, and meant it. "I'm Marcus, by the way. Marcus Chen." The geometric being's shapes rearranged themselves in what might have been surprise. "You're the Deathworlder." It wasn't a question, and the way the being said it made Marcus wince. Throughout the galaxy, humans had earned a reputation that was equal parts terrifying and bewildering. Earth was classified as a Class 12 death world, a planet so hostile that the fact that anything had evolved there was considered a statistical impossibility. The fact that something as complex as humans had not only survived but thrived was seen as either a miracle or a cosmic joke. "I prefer human," Marcus said mildly. "And you are?" "I am." The being paused, and its geometric forms shifted through a rapid sequence of impossible colors. "In your language, I suppose I would be called Prism of Infinite Recursions, reflecting the dance of quantum foam. But you may call me Prism." "Nice to meet you, Prism." Marcus was already learning that most alien names were either impossibly complex or completely unpronounceable by human vocal cords. He'd gotten good at picking the shortest reasonable version. "I must ask," Prism said, its shapes now cycling through what Marcus was beginning to recognize as curiosity patterns. "Is it true what they say about Deathworlders, that you can survive in environments that would kill most sentient beings?" Marcus considered this. Back on Earth, he'd been considered fairly average. He got winded climbing stairs, couldn't run a marathon, and definitely couldn't survive being thrown into space or exposed to radiation. But he'd read the briefing materials about galactic civilization, and he was starting to understand why humans were viewed with such a mixture of fear and fascination. "I guess it depends on what you mean by survive," he said finally. "I'd never tried to survive in a vacuum or anything like that." "But you breathe a toxic mixture of gases," Prism pointed out. "Your planet has acid rain and temperatures that vary by hundreds of degrees. Your weather systems regularly achieve wind speeds that would tear apart most structures we build. And yet you thrive." "Well," Marcus said, thinking of the gentle spring day when he'd left Earth, "when you put it like that, the shuttle docked with a barely perceptible bump, and Whisper of Morning Rain's harmonic voice filled the cabin with a sense of arrival and welcome." Marcus gathered his single bag. Humans, it turned out, traveled light compared to most species and joined the queue moving toward the airlock. The docking bay beyond was a marvel of engineering and aesthetics. The ceiling soared hundreds of meters overhead, supported by what looked like crystallized music. The floor was soft and yielding, automatically adjusting its composition and texture as different species walked across it. The air itself seemed alive, carrying scents and sounds that shifted based on the biochemistry of whoever was experiencing them. For Marcus, it smelled like a library and sounded like distant wind chimes. A reception committee waited to greet the new students. They stood behind a curved desk that seemed to grow from the floor like a shelf fungus, their forms as varied as the students they welcomed. Marcus recognized a few species from his orientation materials. A tall, elegant Vaxian with skin like polished obsidian and eyes that held depths like still water. A cluster of collective minds sharing a single biomechanical body and what appeared to be a sentient equation that had somehow achieved physical form. At the center of the group stood someone Marcus assumed must be in charge, based on the way the others deferred to her presence. She was Kytherian, one of the galaxy's eldest spacefaring races, with skin that shifted between silver and gold depending on the angle of the light. Her features were sharp and delicate, almost crystalline, and when she looked at Marcus, her expression was unreadable. "Welcome to the Galactic Collegiate Institute," she said, her voice carrying in the strange way that Kytherian speech did, seeming to come from the air around her rather than from her mouth. "You may call me Dean Crystal." The new students arranged themselves in a rough semicircle, and Marcus found himself standing slightly apart from the others. It wasn't intentional, but he noticed that the other students had unconsciously moved away from him, leaving a small bubble of empty space around his position. Dean Crystal's gaze swept over the assembled students, pausing for just a moment longer on Marcus before continuing. "You represent the finest young minds from across our galaxy," she continued. "Each of you has been selected not only for your academic achievements but for your potential to contribute to the growing understanding between our species. Here at the Institute, you will study alongside beings whose very existence challenges your preconceptions about life, consciousness, and possibility." Marcus felt a small knot of anxiety in his stomach. When he'd applied to the Institute, it had been almost as a joke. Earth had only recently made contact with galactic civilization, and the idea that they would accept a human student had seemed absurd. But somehow, his application had been approved, and here he was, representing not just himself but his entire species. "Your dormitory assignments and class schedules have been transmitted to your personal communication devices," Dean Crystal announced. "Orientation begins tomorrow at the First Harmonic Resonance. I trust you will all find your accommodation suitable." The other students began to disperse, floating, gliding, or walking toward various exits depending on their preferred method of locomotion. Marcus checked his communication device, a standard galactic interface that had been modified with a human-readable display, and frowned at the result. His dormitory assignment was in Section C7, which according to the map was in a part of the station designed for resilient species with non-standard environmental requirements. His roommate was listed as Species 847, Prime, Vorthak Combat Form, Primary Designation, Flame of Endless Hunger. That doesn't sound ominous at all, Marcus muttered to himself. The journey to Section C7 took him through 3 different atmospheric zones and 2 gravity transitions. By the time he reached his assigned dormitory, he was beginning to understand why he'd been housed separately from the other students. The section was clearly designed for species that didn't fit the standard biological parameters that most of galactic civilization had evolved to accommodate. His dormitory room was larger than he'd expected, with 2 distinct living areas connected by a common space. One area was clearly designed for him, Earth-standard atmosphere, gravity, and what appeared to be furniture-sized for human proportions. The other area was different. The walls glowed with a faint red light and the air shimmered with heat distortions. What he assumed was furniture looked like it had been carved from volcanic glass, and the floor was covered with what appeared to be sand that moved and shifted of its own accord. As Marcus stood in the doorway trying to process what he was seeing, the sand began to swirl and rise, forming a pillar that gradually took on a vaguely humanoid shape. The pillar solidified into a being that stood nearly 3 meters tall, with skin that looked like cooled lava and eyes that burned like coals. "You are the Deathworlder," the being said, its voice like grinding stone. "I am Flame of Endless Hunger, warrior student of the Vorthak hegemony. You may call me Flame." Marcus set down his bag and tried to look casual, despite the fact that he was standing in front of what appeared to be a living volcano. "Nice to meet you, Flame. I'm Marcus." Flame studied him with those burning eyes, and Marcus had the distinct impression he was being evaluated for combat potential. "You are smaller than I expected," Flame said finally. "And you appear to be made of soft materials. How do you survive on a death world if you are so fragile?" It was a fair question, and one that Marcus had been asking himself since his acceptance letter had arrived. "I guess we'll both find out," he said. Flame made a sound that might have been laughter, if laughter could sound like rocks falling down a mountainside. "Indeed we will, soft Marcus. Indeed we will." Marcus unpacked his few belongings in his section of the room while Flame watched with what seemed like curiosity. His possessions were painfully mundane compared to what he'd seen the other students carrying. Some clothes, a few books, actual physical books, which had caused quite a stir at the spaceport, a tablet computer, and a small collection of personal items from Earth. "What is that?" Flame asked, pointing at one of the books. "A collection of stories and information printed on paper." Marcus held it up so Flame could see it better. "This one is poetry, human poetry." "And what is poetry?" Marcus paused. "How do you explain poetry to a living rock creature from a planet where the primary form of artistic expression was probably controlled volcanic eruptions?" "It's words arranged to create beauty or meaning beyond their literal definition," he said finally. Like if your people carved patterns in stone, not just for function, but to make something beautiful." Flame's eyes flared brighter. "Ah, like the battle songs we carve into the mountain faces to commemorate great victories. The patterns tell the story, but they also sing when the wind passes through them." "Read me some of this poetry," Flame commanded, settling into what Marcus assumed was a comfortable position, though it looked like he was just sitting on a pile of very hot rocks. Marcus opened the book randomly and found himself looking at a poem by Robert Frost. "Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveler long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth." As he read, Marcus noticed that Flame had gone perfectly still, his internal fires dimmed to a soft glow. When the poem ended, they sat in silence for a long moment. "This human Frost understands the weight of choices," Flame said finally. On my world, we say that every path not taken becomes a ghost that follows you forever. That's actually a beautiful way to put it, Marcus said and meant it. Perhaps, Flame rumbled, being roommates with a soft Deathworlder will not be as boring as I expected. The next morning arrived with what the Institute called the first harmonic resonance, which Marcus experienced as a gentle vibration that seemed to come from the station's structure itself. According to his schedule, his first class was Fundamentals of Galactic Civilization, taught by Professor Mind-Like Flowing Water in Lecture Hall 7. The lecture hall was another architectural marvel, with seating that automatically adjusted to accommodate each species' preferred orientation and gravitational requirements. Marcus found himself in what amounted to a normal chair at normal gravity, while around him other students floated in bubbles of liquid, perched on crystalline branches, or existed as patterns of light projected onto specialized surfaces. Professor Mind-Like Flowing Water turned out to be a Aquarian, her form constantly shifting like living water held together by some invisible force. When she spoke, her words carried the sound of distant waves. Today we begin our exploration of what it means to be a galactic civilization, she announced, her voice somehow reaching every student in their preferred auditory range. We are part of something larger, something that requires us to expand our understanding of life itself. She gestured, and a holographic display filled the center of the hall, showing the galaxy in all its spiral glory. Each star system you see represents not just a collection of planets, but entire worlds of thought, culture, and possibility. Some of you come from gas giants where thought moves at the speed of storms, others from crystal worlds where consciousness forms in geological time, and some, her gaze settled on Marcus for a moment, some from worlds so hostile that life there has had to become something unprecedented. Marcus felt the attention of every student in the hall focus on him. He tried to look confident and educational rather than terrified and out of place. Can anyone tell me, Professor Mind-Like Flowing Water continued, what makes a species suitable for galactic citizenship? Several appendages, manipulator arms, and energy projections rose around the hall. The professor acknowledged a student that looked like a mobile rose garden. Technological achievement sufficient for interstellar travel, the rose garden student said in a voice like rustling leaves. Certainly, the professor agreed. What else? A crystalline being chimed in with sounds like a glass harmonica, cultural stability, and peaceful intentions. Very good. And this time it was Prism, Marcus's shuttle companion, whose geometric forms shifted into confident patterns. Biological compatibility with galactic standard environments. An excellent point, Professor Mind-Like Flowing Water said. Most galactic civilization has developed around species that evolved in relatively stable, hospitable environments, worlds with gentle weather, predictable seasons, and atmospheric conditions that don't require extreme adaptations. She paused, and Marcus felt the attention of the room focus on him again. But occasionally, she continued, we encounter species that have evolved under conditions so extreme that they challenge our very understanding of what life can endure. These species often bring perspectives and capabilities that expand the possibilities for all galactic civilization. A student that appeared to be a sentient gas cloud contained within a hovering sphere raised what might have been a hand. Professor, are Deathworld species dangerous to have in galactic civilization? Their evolutionary pressures must have made them inherently aggressive. Marcus felt his face flush. He'd heard this argument before, in the diplomatic communications between Earth and the galactic government. The assumption was that any species that had survived on a world as hostile as Earth must have done so through violence and competition. An understandable concern, Professor Mind-Like Flowing Water replied. But evolutionary pressures don't always produce the results we might expect. Marcus, as our first Deathworld student, perhaps you could share your perspective? Every photoreceptor, optical sensor, and sensory apparatus in the hall focused on Marcus. He stood up slowly, his heart racing with what he hoped the other students would interpret as normal Deathworlder intensity rather than social anxiety. I think, he said, his voice carrying further than he'd expected in the hall's acoustic design, that surviving on a dangerous world doesn't necessarily make you dangerous, it might just make you really, really good at cooperation. A ripple of confusion passed through the assembled students, expressed through color changes, harmonic shifts, and electromagnetic fluctuations. "Could you elaborate?" Professor Mind-Like Flowing Water asked, genuine curiosity in her flowing voice. Marcus took a deep breath. "Where I come from, the environment is constantly trying to kill you. Storms, temperature extremes, predators, diseases, natural disasters. If humans had tried to survive through aggression and competition alone, we would have gone extinct before we learned to make fire." He gestured to the holographic galaxy. "We survive because we learn to work together. To share resources, knowledge, and protection. A human alone in the wilderness is dead. A group of humans working together can build cities, explore space, and apparently get accepted to prestigious galactic universities." The silence that followed was profound enough that Marcus could hear the subtle harmonics of the station's life support systems. Finally, a student that looked like a geometric proof achieved sentience spoke up. "But surely your species must have some inherent advantages. Enhanced strength, improved reflexes, natural weapons?" Marcus almost laughed. "I can't run as fast as most Earth animals. I can't see as well as our birds of prey. I don't have claws, armor, or venom. I'm not even particularly strong compared to other Earth species." "Then how," asked the gas cloud student, "do you survive?" Marcus thought for a moment, trying to find a way to explain something that was so fundamental to human nature that he'd never really thought about it before. "We adapt," he said finally, "not biologically, but behaviorally. We figure out what's trying to kill us, and then we figure out how to work around it, work with it, or outlast it. And we do it together." Professor Mind-Like Flowing Water's form rippled in what Marcus was beginning to recognize as approval. "Fascinating. So you would argue that Deathworld evolution selects not for individual superiority but for collective adaptability. I guess that's one way to put it." Marcus said, "We're not individually impressive, but we're really good at solving problems as a group." As he sat back down, Marcus noticed that the bubble of empty space around him had shrunk slightly. A few students had moved closer, and their attention felt more like curiosity now than fear. After class, as students dispersed toward their next obligations, Prism approached Marcus with geometric patterns that seemed to indicate friendly intention. "That was an interesting perspective you shared," Prism said. "I admit I had expected something more dramatic from a Deathworlder's first academic presentation." "Sorry to disappoint," Marcus said, shouldering his bag. "Oh, you didn't disappoint," Prism assured him. "You surprised, which is far more valuable. I wonder, would you be interested in joining a study group? Several of us are planning to work together on Professor Mind-Like Flowing Water's first assignment." Marcus blinked in surprise. He'd expected to spend most of his time at the Institute as an outsider, the weird Deathworld student that everyone was too polite to exclude but too nervous to include. "I'd like that," he said. "What's the assignment?" "We're to choose a significant moment in galactic history and analyze how different species might have approached the situation differently. I thought your perspective on collective problem-solving might be quite valuable." As they walked through the Institute's flowing corridors toward their next classes, Marcus found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, he might actually belong here after all. The real test, he suspected, was yet to come. The study group that Prism had invited Marcus to join turned out to be larger and more diverse than he'd expected. They met in one of the Institute's common areas, a space that could accommodate multiple atmospheric and gravitational requirements simultaneously. Marcus found himself sitting at a table that appeared to be grown from living crystal, surrounded by beings that challenged every assumption he'd ever made about the shape intelligence could take. Besides Prism, there was Melody of Distant Thunder, a resonant whose body was composed of harmonically tuned crystals that chimed softly when she moved. Nexus Point 7 was a collective intelligence, its thoughts distributed across a network of biomechanical nodes that floated in precise formation around its central processing unit. The fourth member of their group was Whisper, a shadewalker whose form existed primarily in dimensions that Marcus couldn't quite perceive, appearing to him as a constantly shifting shadow with occasionally visible edges. "So," Melody chimed, her voice literally musical, "we need to choose a significant moment in galactic history. I was thinking we might examine the first contact protocols established after the Cytherian Vex War." Too obvious, Nexus Point 7 responded, its multiple voices speaking in perfect harmony. "Every study group will choose something from the standard historical curriculum. We need something more interesting." "What about the silence of Sector 7? Whisper suggested, its words seeming to come from just behind Marcus's left ear. The entire sector went dark for 3 cycles, and when communication resumed, every species there had undergone fundamental cultural changes. No one has ever adequately explained what happened. Prism's geometric shapes cycled through consideration patterns. Fascinating, but we don't have enough reliable data to make meaningful analysis. We need something with sufficient documentation but unusual enough to offer fresh perspectives." Marcus had been listening to the discussion while reading through the suggested historical events on his tablet. One entry caught his attention partly because it was marked with a warning symbol that his translation software rendered as "caution disturbing content." "What about the Extinction Protocol incident?" he asked. The conversation stopped. The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear the subtle harmonic resonance of the station's structural supports. "Marcus," Melody said, her chimes taking on a minor key, "that's not typically studied by first-year students." "Why not?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious. "What happened?" Nexus Point 7's nodes rearranged themselves into what Marcus was learning to recognize as the equivalent of uncomfortable shifting. It was the closest galactic civilization has ever come to committing genocide." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "Tell me about it." Whisper's form solidified enough for Marcus to see what might have been a face, though the expression was unreadable. "About 200 cycles ago, long-range surveys discovered a species that appeared to be extremely dangerous. They were spacefaring, technologically advanced, and their home system showed signs of what appeared to be massive military buildup. The Hegemony Council," Prism continued, its colors shifting to darker hues, "decided that this species represented an existential threat to galactic civilization. They authorized the Extinction Protocol, a preemptive strike designed to eliminate the entire species before they could spread beyond their home system." "But they didn't go through with it?" Marcus asked. "They tried," Melody chimed sadly. "A fleet was assembled, equipped with weapons capable of sterilizing entire planets. They reached the target system and prepared to execute the protocol. What stopped them?" "Contact," Nexus Point 7 said. "At the last moment, they established communication with the target species, and they discovered that everything they thought they knew was wrong." Marcus waited for them to continue, but the group seemed reluctant to elaborate. "Wrong how?" he prompted. "The species they'd intended to exterminate," Whisper said quietly, "weren't building weapons. They were building shelters. Their entire civilization was focused on protecting themselves from their environment." A terrible understanding began to dawn on Marcus. They were from a Deathworld. The first Deathworld species galactic civilization had ever encountered. Prism confirmed. They had developed spaceflight not to conquer, but to escape. Their military buildup was actually a desperate attempt to evacuate their entire population before their planet's unstable sun went nova. The silence stretched out again, heavy with implications that Marcus was only beginning to understand. "What happened to them?" he asked finally. "They were relocated to a more stable system," Melody said. "The Hegemony Council formally apologized and established new protocols for first contact with unknown species. The Extinction Protocol was permanently decommissioned. But," Nexus Point 7 added, "it took decades for that species to trust galactic civilization enough to participate fully. Some of them never did." Marcus stared at his tablet, processing what he'd heard. The parallels to Earth's situation were impossible to ignore. When galactic civilization had first detected human radio signals, the initial response had been fear and concern about another Deathworld species entering space. Only careful diplomatic work had prevented a similar catastrophe. "This is perfect," he said finally. The others looked at him in various expressions of surprise and concern. "Perfect?" Melody's chimes carried a discordant note. "Marcus, this is one of the darkest moments in galactic history." "Exactly," Marcus said, his mind racing with possibilities. "Everyone knows the standard historical events. Everyone has analyzed the Cytherian Vex War and the establishment of the trade protocols. But this shows how galactic civilization handles its mistakes, and more importantly, how different species might have prevented the crisis entirely." He looked around the group, seeing their various forms of attention focused on him. "Think about it. How would each of our species have approached first contact with that Deathworld civilization? What does that tell us about our different cultural approaches to the unknown?" Prism's shapes began cycling through excitement patterns. "That's actually brilliant. We could examine the incident from multiple species' perspectives and identify the assumptions that led to the crisis, and propose alternative approaches," Whisper added, its form becoming more solid as it engaged with the idea. "The professors will either love it or consider it too controversial for first-year students," Nexus Point 7 observed. "Only one way to find out," Marcus said. They spent the next several hours diving deep into the historical records of the Extinction Protocol incident. What emerged was a complex picture of fear, misunderstanding, and the dangerous assumptions that different species made when confronted with the incomprehensible. The target species, later known as the Sanctuary Builders, had indeed been conducting massive construction projects throughout their solar system. To galactic observers, these projects looked like weapon platforms, military installations, and the infrastructure of a species preparing for conquest. The reality was both simpler and more heartbreaking. The Sanctuary Builder's star was unstable, prone to massive flares that periodically sterilized their planet's surface. Their entire civilization had developed around cycles of destruction and rebuilding, and their space-based construction projects were vast shelters designed to protect their population during the worst stellar events. "The tragedy," Melody observed as they reviewed the records, "is that if the Hegemony Council had simply watched and waited, the truth would have become obvious." "That's the Etherian approach," Nexus Point 7 noted. "But what about species with different cultural imperatives?" Marcus pulled up comparative data on the species that had made up the Hegemony Council at the time. The Cytherian representatives advocated for immediate action based on logical threat assessment. The Vex pushed for military response because that's how they handle all unknown situations. The collective minds wanted more data, but they were outvoted. "What would humans have done?" Prism asked. Marcus thought about it carefully. Human history was full of first contact scenarios, though admittedly all with other human cultures rather than alien species. The results had been mixed. "Honestly, we probably would have made the same mistake but for different reasons," he said finally. "Humans are really good at assuming that other people think like we do. We would have looked at those construction projects and assumed they were being built by someone with human motivations." "And what would those motivations be?" Whisper asked. "Expansion, conquest, resource acquisition?" "The things that drove human space development." One Marcus paused, considering. "But we also have a cultural tradition of sending ambassadors before armies." "We might have tried talking first." "Might have," Melody chimed thoughtfully. "But would you have been brave enough to approach a species you thought was preparing for war?" "That's the question, isn't it?" Marcus said. "How do you communicate with someone when you're afraid they might kill you for trying?" As they worked deeper into the research, Marcus began to notice something interesting. Each species in their group was approaching the problem from a fundamentally different angle. Prism, with its crystalline logic, was focused on the mathematical probabilities of different first contact scenarios. Melody was examining the harmonic patterns of communication and how different species might interpret similar signals. Nexus Point 7 was analyzing the decision-making processes of collective versus individual intelligences. Whisper was exploring the psychological dimensions of fear and misunderstanding. And Marcus found himself thinking about something else entirely: the Sanctuary Builders themselves. Has anyone considered, he said during a break in their research, what it must have been like for the sanctuary builders when that fleet showed up? The others paused in their various activities to focus on him. They're desperately trying to save their entire civilization from their dying star, Marcus continued. They're working around the clock on the largest engineering project in their history, and suddenly, unknown ships appear in their system, clearly military, clearly powerful, and clearly not friendly. The records indicate they attempted to communicate, Nexus Point 7 said. Right, but think about it from their perspective. They're a Deathworld species, which means they've spent their entire evolutionary history dealing with existential threats. Their planet tries to kill them on a regular schedule. And now, just when they think they've found a way to survive, the universe sends them a new threat from outside their system entirely. Marcus stood up and began pacing, a very human behavior that seemed to fascinate his alien study partners. They had no way of knowing whether this fleet was connected to their stellar crisis or not. For all they knew, their star's instability might have been caused by these aliens as a prelude to invasion. Or the aliens might be waiting for their star to finish the job before moving in to claim the system. You're suggesting they might have perceived the galactic fleet as an additional environmental hazard, Prism observed, its pattern shifting to analytical mode. Exactly. And if there's one thing Deathworld species are good at, it's adapting to new environmental hazards. Melody's chimes took on a worried tone. You think they were preparing to fight? I think they were preparing to survive, Marcus said, which for a Deathworld species might be the same thing. This put an entirely new spin on their analysis. If the sanctuary builders had been treating the galactic fleet as another environmental threat to be overcome, then their behavior during first contact took on different meanings. This changes everything, Whisper said, its form becoming more defined as it engaged with the implications. We're not just analyzing galactic civilization's mistakes, we're exploring the fundamental challenge of communication between species with completely different survival frameworks. They worked late into the station's night cycle, building a comprehensive analysis that examined the extinction protocol incident from multiple perspectives. By the time they were finished, they had something that was part historical analysis, part xenopsychological study, and part philosophical exploration of the nature of fear and misunderstanding. Professor Mind Like Flowing Water is either going to be impressed or concerned, Melody observed as they prepared to submit their work. Probably both, Marcus agreed. The next day, their other classes seemed almost mundane by comparison. Marcus attended basic quantum mechanics, taught by a professor who existed as a probability cloud, galactic economics, surprisingly similar to Earth economics, but with more variables for species that didn't use physical currency, and xenobiology fundamentals, where he discovered that humans were considered an extremely unusual example of bilateral symmetry in a hostile environment. But it was during his interspecies communication class that the first real crisis occurred. The class was taught by Professor Harmony of Many Voices, a symphonic whose body was composed of hundreds of small, independently moving parts that created complex musical patterns when she spoke. The classroom was arranged in a circle, with each student's environmental needs accommodated by individual atmospheric and gravitational zones. Today we will practice real-time translation and cultural interpretation, Professor Harmony announced, her many parts creating a gentle melody. Each of you will share a cultural concept from your species that has no direct translation in galactic standard. It was an interesting exercise. Marcus listened as his classmates struggled to explain concepts like the Etherean notion of time taste, the flavor that different temporal experiences carried, and the collective understanding of thought weight, the mass that ideas acquired when shared among multiple minds. When it came to Marcus's turn, he thought carefully about what human concept might be most difficult to translate. Humans have a word, he began, that we use to describe a complex emotional and social situation. The word is homesickness. Several students made sounds or displays that indicated confusion. It refers to the sadness and longing you feel when you're separated from your home, your family, your familiar environment, Marcus continued. But it's more than just missing something. It's almost a physical sensation, like being ill, but caused by distance rather than disease. Professor Harmony's parts rearranged themselves into curious patterns. And this is common among humans? Universal, I think. Everyone experiences it to some degree when they're far from home. A student that appeared to be made of crystallized sound chimed in. But surely all species experience some distress when separated from familiar environments. Maybe, Marcus said, but I don't think it's the same thing. Homesickness isn't just missing something familiar. It's your environment being part of who you are, so that when you're separated from it, you're not quite complete. He paused, trying to find a better way to explain it. When I left Earth, I wasn't just leaving a planet. I was leaving gravity that felt right, air that smelled right, sounds that made sense to my ears. I was leaving the place where my species belongs. And now, even though I'm happy to be here and excited about learning, part of me always feels like I'm displaced. The silence that followed was profound, but it felt different from the academic silences Marcus had experienced before. This felt personal, almost intimate. Finally, a gas-form student contained within a mobility sphere spoke up. I think I understand this concept, but I'm surprised to hear it from a Deathworlder. Why? Marcus asked. Because your species evolved on a world that was constantly trying to kill you. Why would you feel attached to such a hostile environment? It was a fair question and one that Marcus had been asking himself since arriving at the Institute. Maybe that's exactly why we feel attached to it, he said finally. It's not that Earth is a pleasant place to live. It's that Earth is where we learned to live. All of our adaptations, all of our cultural solutions, all of our ways of understanding the world, they're all designed for Earth. He gestured around the classroom with its carefully controlled environments and perfectly calibrated atmospheric mixes. This is paradise compared to Earth. The air is clean, the temperature is constant, there are no predators or natural disasters or diseases. But it doesn't feel like home because it's not the place my species learned to be human. Professor Harmony's parts had gone very still. That's a profound insight, Marcus. You're suggesting that homesickness isn't just missing comfort, but missing the environment that shaped your identity. I guess so, Marcus said. We are what we are because Earth made us this way. Being separated from Earth means being separated from the context that makes us make sense. The discussion that followed was unlike anything Marcus had experienced in his previous classes. Students began sharing their own experiences of displacement, of missing not just their homeworlds but the fundamental environmental conditions that had shaped their evolution and culture. It turned out that homesickness, or something like it, was indeed universal. But as Marcus had suspected, the human version was particularly intense because humans had been forced to develop such a deep, survival-based connection to their environment. This explains, observed the gas-form student, why Deathworld species are often reluctant to fully integrate into galactic civilization. It's not just culture shock, it's a form of environmental displacement that affects their fundamental identity. After class, several students approached Marcus to continue the conversation. They wanted to understand more about how humans had developed such a strong attachment to such a hostile world, and what that meant for human integration into galactic society. But it was Flame of Endless Hunger who was waiting for Marcus when he returned to their dormitory that evening, and his massive form was radiating what Marcus had learned to recognize as agitation. Soft Marcus, Flame rumbled as soon as Marcus entered their common area. We need to discuss something important. Marcus set down his bag and looked at his roommate with concern. What's wrong? I have been monitoring galactic communication channels as part of my strategic studies, Flame said, his internal fires burning brighter than usual. There are discussions happening in the Hegemony Council about you, about me specifically, about your species, about whether humans should be allowed continued access to galactic technology and education. Flame's rocky features arranged themselves into what Marcus had learned was his equivalent of a concerned frown. There are some species who believe that Deathworlders represent an inherent security risk. Marcus felt a familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. He'd hoped that his successful integration into the Institute would help demonstrate that humans could be valuable members of galactic civilization. Apparently, he'd been naive. What kind of security risk? He asked. The kind that leads to extinction protocols, Flame said grimly. Marcus sat down heavily in his human-sized chair, the weight of implications settling over him like a blanket made of lead. How long do we have? The discussions are still preliminary, Flame said, but Marcus, if they decide that humans are too dangerous, they won't just revoke your student status. They'll revoke your species' membership in galactic civilization entirely. Looking at his roommate's concerned expression, Marcus realized that his time at the Institute had suddenly become about much more than his own education. Everything he did, every interaction he had, every impression he made was potentially influencing the future relationship between humanity and the rest of the galaxy. The pressure was terrifying. But as he thought about it, Marcus realized something else. He wasn't facing this crisis alone. He had friends now, allies who understood him and were willing to help. And if there was one thing humans were good at, it was facing impossible odds as a team. Well, he said, looking up at Flame with what he hoped was confidence rather than desperation, I guess we'd better make sure they make the right decision. Flame's expression shifted into what Marcus had learned to recognize as his version of a fierce grin. Indeed, soft Marcus. Indeed we shall. Marcus spent that night staring at the ceiling of his dormitory room, listening to the gentle rumbling sounds that Flame made while sleeping. The weight of representing his entire species in galactic civilization felt impossibly heavy, and every interaction he'd had since arriving at the Institute now took on new significance. Had he been too aggressive in class discussions? Too passive? Had his explanation of homesickness made humans sound weak and dependent, or had it helped other species understand human psychology? Every word, every gesture, every moment of confusion or success was potentially being evaluated as evidence for or against humanity's place among the stars. He must have finally dozed off, because he woke to the sound of Flame moving around in the volcanic section of their room. The Vorthak's internal fires were burning low, which Marcus had learned indicated either deep concentration or significant worry. "Morning, Flame," Marcus said, sitting up and stretching. "Any more news from your monitoring?" "Nothing concrete," Flame rumbled, his voice carrying the grinding sound that indicated frustration. "But the discussions are continuing. There will likely be some kind of formal evaluation process." Marcus got ready for his classes with mechanical precision, his mind racing through possibilities. If the Hegemony Council was going to evaluate humanity's fitness for galactic civilization, they would probably start by evaluate the one human they had direct access to. Him. The thought was both terrifying and oddly liberating. At least he would have some agency in the process. He wouldn't just be sitting on Earth waiting for alien bureaucrats to decide his species' fate. His first class that day was Advanced Physics of Exotic Matter, taught by Professor Quantum State Superposition in one of the Institute's specialized laboratories. The professor existed in multiple probability states simultaneously, appearing as a constantly shifting collection of possible forms until observed directly, at which point she would collapse into whichever version was most appropriate for the current discussion. Marcus had been struggling with this class more than the others. Physics was physics, but when you started dealing with matter that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously and energy that responded to conscious observation, human intuition became more of a hindrance than a help. Today's lesson was on the practical applications of probability manipulation in engineering projects. Professor Quantum State demonstrated by creating a bridge made of materialized possibility. It existed because she believed it might exist, and it was solid because the probability of its supporting weight was non-zero. The key, she explained, currently manifesting as a collection of geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly, is understanding that reality at the quantum level is far more flexible than most species assume. Matter wants to exist in whatever state is most probable given the circumstances. A student that looked like a mobile equation asked, "But how do we calculate probability for systems that involve conscious observation? The observer effect varies dramatically between species." "An excellent question," Professor Quantum State replied, shifting into a form that resembled a very complex mathematical proof. Different types of consciousness interact with quantum systems in different ways. Some species observe passively, others actively influence through expectation, and a few actually seem to negotiate with probability itself. D. She gestured to Marcus. Marcus, as our resident Deathworlder, perhaps you could share how humans typically interact with uncertain systems? Marcus felt the familiar sensation of being put on the spot, but this time it felt different. This wasn't just about answering a question correctly. This was potentially about demonstrating human capabilities to his classmates and professors. Well, he began carefully. Humans tend to approach uncertain systems by trying to control as many variables as possible. We don't usually try to influence probability directly. We try to engineer situations where the outcomes we want become more likely. Could you give an example? Marcus thought about the human approach to the fundamental uncertainty of existence on Earth. If there's a chance of storms, we build storm shelters. If there's a chance of predators, we create weapons and develop group hunting strategies. If there's a chance of crop failure, we plant multiple types of crops in different locations. Professor Quantum State shifted into a form that suggested interest. So humans respond to probability by attempting to create multiple contingency plans? Exactly. We assume that bad things will probably happen, so we prepare for as many bad things as we can think of. The mobile equation student chimed in again. But that's essentially probability manipulation through physical intervention rather than conscious influence. I suppose so, Marcus said. We change the circumstances rather than trying to change the probability directly. Fascinating, Professor Quantum State observed. Most species that develop advanced physics learn to work with quantum uncertainty by accepting it. Humans appear to have developed technology specifically to minimize uncertainty through brute force preparation. After class, as Marcus gathered his materials, he overheard two students discussing his answer. Typical Deathworlder approach, one was saying to the other. Instead of learning to work with the universe, they try to impose their will on it. But it seems effective, the other replied. Look at how quickly they've advanced since making contact with us. Marcus wasn't sure whether to be encouraged or worried by the conversation. Were his human instincts helping or hurting humanity's case for galactic citizenship? His next class provided a partial answer. Interspecies ethics was taught by Dean Crystal herself, and it was one of the most challenging courses offered at the Institute. The class met in a specialized chamber that could simultaneously accommodate the ethical frameworks of multiple species, creating an environment where moral concepts could be directly shared between minds that operated on entirely different principles. Today, Dean Crystal announced her crystalline features catching and refracting the chamber's specialized lighting. We will examine a theoretical scenario. A deep space exploration vessel encounters an unknown species that appears to be in distress. The species' technology is inferior to the galactic standard. Their biology suggests they come from a hostile environment and they are requesting assistance. She paused, allowing the scenario to settle in everyone's minds. The question is, what is the ethical obligation of galactic civilization in this situation? It was, Marcus realized, a thinly veiled version of the human first contact scenario. Dean Crystal was either testing the class's understanding of recent events or specifically evaluating how Marcus would respond to a hypothetical version of his own species' situation. The discussion that followed revealed the complex ethical frameworks that different species brought to such decisions. The Etherians argued for cautious observation and minimal intervention. The collectives wanted to gather more data before making any decisions. The crystalline beings applied pure logical analysis to determine the most efficient course of action. When it came to Marcus's turn to speak, he felt the weight of Dean Crystal's attention like a physical presence. I think, he said carefully, that the ethical obligation depends on what you believe about the nature of consciousness and community. Elaborate, Dean Crystal requested, her voice carrying harmonic undertones that suggested this was an important moment. If you believe that consciousness is rare and valuable, then you have an obligation to preserve it wherever you find it. If you believe that suffering is something that should be prevented when possible, then you have an obligation to help. And if you believe that intelligence and culture represent achievements that belong to the universe rather than just to individual species, then you have an obligation to make sure those achievements aren't lost. Marcus looked around the chamber, seeing various forms of attention focused on him. But more than that, he continued, I think we have an obligation to remember that we might be wrong about what we're seeing. The distressed species might have capabilities we don't recognize. Their primitive technology might be adapted to conditions we don't understand. Their requests for help might be based on knowledge about their situation that we don't have. So you argue for intervention based on humility rather than superiority? Dean Crystal asked. I argue for engagement based on the assumption that other conscious beings are competent to understand their own needs, even if we don't initially understand their circumstances. The silence that followed felt different from the academic pauses Marcus had grown accustomed to. This felt like evaluation, as if his answer was being weighed against some internal standard. Finally, a student that existed as a pattern of organized energy spoke up. But what if engagement poses risks to galactic civilization? What if the unknown species represents a genuine threat? Marcus felt the trap in the question, but he also felt the importance of answering honestly. Then you try to understand the nature of the threat, he said. You communicate, you negotiate, you look for solutions that address everyone's needs, but you don't assume that elimination is the only option until you've exhausted every alternative. And if communication fails? If negotiation is impossible? Marcus thought about human history, about all the times that communication had failed and negotiation had proved impossible. Then you prepare to defend yourself while continuing to look for alternatives. But you never, ever give up on the possibility that there might be a solution you haven't thought of yet. Dean Crystal's expression was unreadable, but Marcus thought he detected a slight shift in her crystalline features that might have been approval. After class, Marcus was gathering his things when Dean Crystal approached him. Marcus, she said, her voice carrying private harmonics that wouldn't be audible to the other students, I would like to speak with you privately. Please come to my office after your final class today. The rest of Marcus's classes passed in a blur of anxiety and anticipation. When he finally made his way to Dean Crystal's office, he found it to be unlike any space he'd encountered on the station. The walls seemed to be made of living light, constantly shifting through colors and patterns that responded to the dean's emotional state. The furniture grew from the floor as needed, and the air itself carried information in the form of subtle chemical signals that his human nose couldn't quite interpret. Sit, please, Dean Crystal said, and a chair formed itself to Marcus's specifications. Am I in trouble? Marcus asked, deciding that directness was probably his best approach. Dean Crystal's features shifted into what might have been amusement. Not trouble, exactly. But we do need to discuss your situation. She moved to what appeared to be a window, though the view beyond showed the swirling patterns of hyperspace rather than any recognizable stellar phenomena. You are aware, I assume, that your presence here has generated considerable discussion within galactic government. Flame told me that there were concerns about humans as a security risk. Concerns, yes. But also interest. Your performance at the Institute has been noteworthy. Marcus wasn't sure if that was good or bad. Noteworthy how? Your academic work is competent but not exceptional. Your social integration has been successful but not remarkable. What is noteworthy is the effect you have had on your fellow students. Dean Crystal turned back to face him, her crystalline features reflecting the shifting light of the walls. Since your arrival, academic discussion in your classes has become more dynamic. Students are asking questions they hadn't thought of before. Study groups are forming across traditional species boundaries. The intellectual climate of the Institute has become more adventurous. She paused, and Marcus got the impression she was choosing her words carefully. There is a theory among educational psychologists that learning is enhanced by the presence of what they call cognitive dissonance agents, individuals whose perspectives are sufficiently different from the norm that they force others to examine their assumptions. And you think I'm a cognitive dissonance agent? I think you're something we've never seen before. a representative of a species whose fundamental approach to existence challenges every assumption we've made about consciousness, survival, and the nature of intelligence itself. Marcus felt a chill. That sounds like it could be either very good or very bad for humanity's future in galactic civilization. Indeed, Dean Crystal agreed. Which is why I wanted to speak with you. There will be a formal evaluation, Marcus. Representatives from the major galactic species will visit the Institute to observe you and assess humanity's suitability for continued membership in our civilization. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Everything he'd feared was coming to pass, and it would all depend on his performance under the scrutiny of alien bureaucrats who were predisposed to see his species as a potential threat. When? He asked. Soon. Perhaps within the next few cycles. I wanted to give you advance warning because... Dean Crystal paused and her features shifted through patterns that Marcus couldn't interpret. Because I believe that humanity's perspective is valuable to galactic civilization, but I also believe that the evaluation process will be challenging for you. Challenging how? They will not simply observe your normal activities. They will create situations designed to test your responses under stress. They will want to see how a human reacts when faced with threat, crisis, and moral dilemmas. Marcus thought about what that might involve and felt his stomach clench with anxiety. What should I do? Be yourself, Dean Crystal said simply. But be the best version of yourself. Remember that you're not just representing humanity. You're representing the idea that different doesn't necessarily mean dangerous. That evening, Marcus called an emergency meeting of his study group. They gathered in their usual common area, but the atmosphere was tense with the knowledge that their friend was facing something that could determine the fate of his entire species. So they're going to test you, Prism said, its geometric form cycling through agitation patterns. Test how? I don't know, Marcus admitted. Dean Crystal said they would create stressful situations to see how I respond. That's not fair, Melody chimed, her crystal body resonating with indignant harmonics. You're a student, not a specimen. But that's exactly what I am, Marcus said. I'm the only human most of these species have ever met. Everything they think they know about humanity is based on me. Nexus Point 7's nodes rearranged themselves thoughtfully. Then we need to make sure you're prepared for whatever they might throw at you. How? Whisper's form solidified enough to be clearly visible by doing what humans do best, by working together to solve the problem. Over the next several hours, they developed what they somewhat grandly called the Human Preparation Protocol. They would spend every available moment preparing Marcus for potential scenarios, helping him think through responses that would demonstrate the best aspects of human nature while honestly representing his species' capabilities and limitations. Remember, Prism advised as they worked, they're not looking for perfection, they're looking for predictability. They want to know that humans can be trusted to respond to situations in ways that don't endanger galactic civilization. But also, Melody added, they need to see that humans bring something valuable. Otherwise, why take the risk? It was Flame who provided perhaps the most important insight when Marcus returned to their dormitory that night. Soft Marcus, the Vortax said, his rocky features arranged in serious contemplation. I have been thinking about what makes a warrior worthy of respect. Okay, Marcus said, settling into his chair and preparing for one of Flame's philosophical observations. It is not strength alone, though strength matters. It is not courage alone, though courage is essential. What makes a warrior truly worthy is the wisdom to know when to fight and when to seek other solutions. Flame's internal fires burned bright as he continued. Your species survived on a death world not because you were the strongest or the fastest or the most dangerous. You survived because you were wise enough to know when to fight your environment, when to adapt to it, and when to work together to overcome it. That's the quality they need to see in you during this evaluation. Not that you are harmless. Any species capable of interstellar travel is potentially dangerous, but that you are wise enough to choose your battles carefully. As Marcus lay in bed that night, listening to the gentle sounds of the station's night cycle, he realized that Flame was right. The evaluation wouldn't be about proving that humans were perfect or even that they were safe. It would be about proving that they were wise enough to be trusted with the responsibilities that came with galactic citizenship. The question was whether he could demonstrate that wisdom under whatever pressure the evaluators decided to apply. He was about to find out. The evaluators arrived on a ship that looked like it had been grown rather than built, its organic curves and flowing lines suggesting that it was as much a living creature as a vessel. Marcus watched it dock with the Institute from the observation lounge, surrounded by his study group and what felt like half the student body. "I've never seen a ship like that," Melody whispered, her crystal harmonics muted with awe. "It's a synthesis vessel," Nexus Point 7 explained, its multiple voices speaking in subdued tones. "It means the evaluation committee includes representatives from the really old species." Prism's geometric form shifted into worried patterns. The older the species, the more conservative they tend to be about new additions to galactic civilization. Marcus felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach, but this time it was accompanied by something else: determination. He'd spent the last week preparing for this moment, and his friends had helped him think through dozens of potential scenarios. He was as ready as he could possibly be. The first indication that the evaluation had begun came during what should have been a routine morning meal in the Institute's main dining facility. Marcus was sitting with his usual group when Dean Crystal approached their table, accompanied by three beings that radiated authority in ways that made the air around them feel different. "Marcus," Dean Crystal said, "I'd like you to meet the evaluation committee. This is Senior Arbiter Cosmos, dancing through infinite recursions of the Elder Collectives. Judge Prime Equilibrium of crystallized thought from the Catherian High Council, and War Leader Stone that breaks mountains representing the Vorthak hegemony." Each introduction was accompanied by a subtle shift in the local environment. The Elder Collective representative existed as a pattern of organized energy that made the nearby air taste of electricity and possibility. The Catherian judge stood like a pillar of living crystal, her presence making light behave in strange and beautiful ways. The Vorthak war leader was nearly as large as flame, his rocky skin scarred with patterns that spoke of countless battles. "It's an honor to meet you," Marcus said, standing and offering what he hoped was an appropriate gesture of respect. The Elder Collective's response came not as words, but as a direct transmission of meaning into Marcus's mind: curiosity, examination, potential risk evaluation, beginning now. Judge Prime Equilibrium spoke in the harmonic tones of formal Catherian, human-designated Marcus Chen. "We come to observe and assess your species' suitability for continued participation in galactic civilization. You will be evaluated across multiple criteria: psychological stability, ethical reasoning, social cooperation, and response to stress scenarios." War Leader Stone that breaks mountains rumbled in a voice like grinding boulders. "Show us what humans are made of. Small, soft skin? Show us whether your species deserves to walk among the stars." The formal evaluation began immediately. Marcus found himself escorted to a specialized chamber that could simulate a wide variety of environments and scenarios. The walls were lined with sensors that monitored everything from his heart rate to his brainwave patterns, and he was accompanied by the three evaluators plus Dean Crystal and Professor Mindlike Flowing Water as observers. The first test was psychological stability under isolation. Marcus was placed in a sealed chamber with no external stimuli beyond basic life support. The goal was to see how he would respond to sensory deprivation and complete social isolation, conditions that could occur during deep space travel or emergency situations. For the first hour, Marcus tried to stay calm and focused. He meditated, did mental exercises, and tried to remember the advice his friends had given him. But as the hours stretched on, he began to understand why this was considered a stress test. The silence was oppressive, and the complete absence of environmental variation made time feel elastic and unreliable. By what he estimated was the fourth hour, Marcus was talking to himself just to maintain connection to the sound of human speech. By the sixth hour, he was pacing the small chamber, using movement to mark the passage of time. By the 8th hour, he had begun constructing elaborate mental stories about his friends and family, creating imaginary conversations to replace the social contact he was missing. When the test finally ended, after what turned out to be 12 hours, Marcus emerged to find the evaluators deep in discussion. "Interesting," Judge Prime Equilibrium was saying as he approached. The subject maintained coherent thought patterns throughout the isolation period, but showed increasing signs of social stress. Most Deathworld species show aggression or panic under such conditions, War Leader Stone observed. This one shows creativity. He constructed social interactions from memory and imagination. The Elder Collective's communication arrived as a complex burst of meaning. Social dependency confirmed, but adaptive resilience demonstrated curious methodology. "How did I do?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "You responded exactly as we would expect a human to respond," Dean Crystal replied diplomatically. The evaluation continues. The second test was ethical reasoning under pressure. Marcus was presented with a series of increasingly complex moral dilemmas, each one designed to reveal his underlying value system and decision-making process. The scenario started simple. A ship with limited resources can encounter survivors from two different vessels but can only rescue one group. Marcus's response was to look for creative solutions that might allow rescuing both groups, or at minimum to establish criteria for the decision that weren't based on species preference. The dilemmas became more complex. A research station discovers a cure for a devastating disease, but the cure requires harvesting a resource that would drive another species to extinction. Marcus found himself arguing for research into alternative approaches and for sharing the decision-making process with representatives of all affected species. The most challenging scenario involved first contact with a species that appeared to be aggressively hostile but might simply be responding to perceived threats. Marcus's response was to advocate for communication attempts combined with defensive preparations, and to assume that the hostility was based on misunderstanding until proven otherwise. "Your responses show consistent patterns," Judge Prime Equilibrium observed when the test concluded. "You prioritize communication and cooperation, even in situations where such approaches might be disadvantageous to yourself or your species. You also show willingness to accept risk in order to avoid harm to others," War Leader Stone added, though his tone made it unclear whether he considered this a positive or negative trait. The Elder Collective's message carried overtones of puzzlement. Altruistic tendency confirmed, but mechanism, unclear evolutionary pressure analysis required. The third test was the one Marcus had been dreading: social cooperation under artificially induced conflict. He was placed in a scenario with several other beings, actors playing roles designed to create interpersonal tension and competition for limited resources. The setting was a damaged space station where life support was failing and not everyone could be evacuated before the station was destroyed. Marcus found himself working with a group that included an arrogant Catherian scientist who insisted that his research was too valuable to lose, a collective node that kept trying to optimize the group's decisions without considering individual preferences, and a Vorthak warrior who wanted to settle disputes through combat trials. The artificial nature of the scenario didn't make it any less stressful. As the simulated crisis escalated and the group struggled to work together, Marcus found himself falling back on the collaborative strategies that had served humans well throughout their history. He listened to everyone's concerns, even when they seemed unreasonable. He looked for solutions that addressed multiple needs simultaneously. When direct negotiation failed, he proposed systems for making group decisions that everyone could accept even if they weren't everyone's first choice. Most importantly, he refused to give up on any member of the group, even when they seemed to be acting against the team's interests. The scenario climaxed when the Vorthak character challenged him to single combat for the right to decide who would be evacuated first. Instead of accepting or refusing the challenge, Marcus proposed an alternative. If the Vorthak was willing to help him implement a more complex evacuation plan, they could save 2 additional lives beyond what the current plan allowed. "You're asking me to trust you," the actor rumbled in character. "I'm asking you to trust that we can find a better solution if we work together," Marcus replied. The scenario ended with the successful evacuation of the entire group, though it required sacrifices and compromises from everyone involved. When the actors dropped their roles and the evaluators emerged from their observation positions, Marcus felt drained but cautiously optimistic. "Remarkable," Judge Prime Equilibrium said, her crystalline features reflecting complex patterns of light. The subject consistently prioritized group survival over individual advantage, even when doing so required personal risk. He also refused to accept zero-sum thinking, War Leader Stone observed. When presented with impossible choices, he spent his time looking for ways to change the parameters of the problem. The Elder Collective's response was longer and more complex than before. Cooperation instinct confirmed leadership potential, demonstrated risk assessment shows concerning tendency toward optimism, but pragmatic implementation suggests survival. Instead of another formal scenario, Marcus was simply told to go about his normal daily routine while the evaluators observed. He attended classes, worked on assignments, and spent time with his friends, all while being monitored by beings who were evaluating his species' fitness for galactic civilization. It was during Professor Quantum State Superposition's advanced physics class that the test revealed its true nature. The lesson was on quantum entanglement in biological systems, and Professor Quantum State was demonstrating how certain species could maintain conscious connection across vast distances through quantum-linked neural networks. The practical applications are limited, she explained, while existing in several probability states simultaneously, because the entanglement is fragile and easily disrupted by external interference. Marcus raised his hand. If you could create a network of entangled particles distributed across ships or stations, you could maintain contact even if normal communication systems failed. An interesting thought, Professor Quantum State replied, but the energy requirements would be prohibitive, and the network would still be vulnerable to quantum decoherence. But what if you didn't try to maintain the entanglement artificially? Marcus persisted. What if you created a system where the entanglement was naturally reinforced by the biological processes of the species using it? The class fell silent as Professor Quantum State considered this suggestion. Finally, she manifested in her most stable form, a humanoid shape composed of mathematical equations. That's actually a novel approach. You're suggesting biomechanical quantum networks that use living systems as stabilizing elements. I'm suggesting that maybe we're thinking about this backwards, Marcus said, warming to the idea. Instead of trying to impose artificial quantum systems on biological ones, what if we designed biological systems that naturally maintain quantum coherence? The discussion that followed was unlike anything Marcus had experienced in the class before. Students from multiple species began building on his idea, suggesting refinements and applications that Marcus hadn't even considered. By the end of the class, they had outlined a theoretical framework for biological quantum communication that Professor Quantum State declared worthy of serious research. As Marcus left the classroom, he found War Leader Stone waiting for him in the corridor. "That was instructive," the massive Vorthax said, his scarred features arranged in what Marcus had learned to recognize as thoughtful contemplation. "The physics discussion? The way you think about problems," Stone clarified. When presented with a technical limitation, your first instinct was not to accept the limitation but to reconceptualize the entire approach. Marcus wasn't sure if this was meant as a compliment or a criticism. "Is that good or bad from your perspective?" "Dangerous," Stone said bluntly, "but potentially valuable. Your species appears to be incapable of accepting that some problems cannot be solved." That evening, Marcus met with his study group in their usual common area, but the atmosphere was different. Everyone seemed to understand that the evaluation was reaching a critical phase, and that the